So yes, welcome everybody. So tonight is our Calming Your Fussy Baby night. And what that means is I'm going to go over all the most common reasons that would cause your baby to be fussy, reasons that they would cry, and then what to do about it. Because I know as a mom, when I was a new mom and also working with lots of new moms, how frustrating that can be and how upsetting it could be. I remember just sobbing. My baby would sob, would cry, and I'd be sobbing alongside because I just didn't know what to do. And it can undermine so much of our feelings about ourselves as moms, about breastfeeding, just all of it. So when you think about your newborn, okay, and the fussiness that happens, especially in the beginning, it could be so unexplainable. And I used to teach a class in my in my learning center, a live class. It was called Predict. Isn't that a great name for a class on babies? Okay. The reason I called it Predict was because babies, although they may not be schedulable, if that's a word, like there's no way to schedule them, there's no way to know exactly when things are going to happen. There is a way to predict what they may do and what you can do to help them, if you know what those things are. Now, the thing that most people don't know is that babies, when they're born, are born very immature in many ways. Well, we know they're immature, but they're born immature in many of their bodily functions. Their stomachs, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. But main thing to understand is that their brains are born immature. And what that means is they have a very difficult time self-soothing. So newborns come out of the womb. They are unable to really use their hands very much. They can get them by their face if they're like they were in the uterus. Okay, if it's up by their face, they'll suck on their hands, but they can't really keep them there. And so they can't really suck their thumbs at that point. They can't really soothe themselves. And so one of the things that you have to learn how to do is to soothe your baby in ways that will help them feel comfortable that they can't necessarily do for themselves. And when you hear about people talking about colic, okay, and you hear this word thrown around a lot, that kind of describes what? A crying baby. Colic really is just, in my opinion, your baby's inability to self-soothe. Now, this fussy period usually starts around 2 weeks past their due date, not immediately. And it's pretty predictable, like I was saying. It starts around 2 weeks and it peaks at around 6 weeks past the due date. When I do consultations with new parents and they'll come in with their babies and their babies are very sleepy and they'll say, you know, my baby's sleepy, or I'll hear this in the hospital too, right after delivery. You know, my baby's an angel, my baby sleeps all the time, or I'm struggling with breastfeeding because my baby's constantly sleeping and won't wake up. That usually ends around 2 weeks past the due date, and it's very predictable. If your baby's born early, it may be 3 weeks after their birth, or 4 weeks, depending on how early they are. If they're born late, it could be sooner. So it's usually very right on the money, okay? And then it peaks around 6 weeks. And I'll warn parents about this because I'll say, take that 6 week mark, that's 6 weeks past the due date, and put that on your calendar because it's very clear that around that time, you're going to probably have a harder time. Your baby's just going to be crying a lot more. But there are so that's the bad news, is that there's a 2 to 6 week period where they're just very, very fussy. And there's things that, the good news is that there's things that you can do to make that easier. When your baby comes out and they're fussy like that, what's happening is they are used to being inside your belly, okay? And lots of people talk about these different things when it comes to the baby being used to the characteristics of the womb, okay? So what can you do to ease the fussiness in your baby or to help soothe your baby is to kind of model all the different things that they have in the womb. Womb simulation is basically what you're looking to do. What are some of the things that the baby was experiencing inside your belly? What were some of the characteristics of that? You have to think about that. Some of those characteristics would be movement, okay, because you're not being still the whole time, all right? You're moving around, and so that movement is something that your baby's looking for. And when we get into burping in a little while, I'm going to show you what I mean by that. But usually people will hold their babies, and I'm going to just tilt the screen a little bit. Usually people will hold the babies and they're trying to be very gentle, and the baby can't feel this very small movement. They actually want to be moved a little bit more. Now, I'm not talking about shaking your baby, okay? That's very important to know the difference, not shaking, but more movement and stronger movement is something that your baby can actually feel. And it's something that innately, like you're posting here, swaying, okay, innately we know to like sway with our babies. That's because babies like that, all right? So movement, white noise, and also tight confinement, okay? Your baby, what seems like would be very uncomfortable to you, where you would want to be stretching your arms and stretching your legs, to a baby, what they're used to and all they've ever known the entire time that they've been alive is tight confinement. What that means is their arms up, their arms closer to their bodies, their knees more bent, their bodies feeling wrapped and held, okay? So when you have a baby who possibly wants to stay at the breast all the time, think about it. You know, you're holding your baby at the breast, the baby wants to be there. The baby is feeling nice and tight and cuddled next to you. All those things are going to make the baby feel more like inside the womb, all right? So these are all important things to keep in mind. And when you just, you know, lay your baby down and think, okay, the baby's just going to be fine laying there, that's usually not going to be the case. The baby also has certain reflexes that they're born with. In fact, that's basically all they're born with is reflexes. And some of those reflexes are very important, like the reflex to suck. Thank God we don't need to teach babies how to suck. They come out and they know how to suck. That's, you know, for the most part, that's a reflex. The nipple goes into their mouth and they suck. That's a life-sustaining reflex, and they have a very strong need to do that. So that's why, you know, babies will want to linger at the breast, whether it's to eat or just to suck. They need that sucking, that sucking time. And it's one of the reasons why babies will take pacifiers too, in between feedings, to be able to keep on having that sucking need met. Okay, so that's one of the reflexes. Now that's a very needed reflex. One of the reflexes that they're born with that can be very frustrating is something called the Moro reflex or the startle reflex. You all know what I mean. It's you're holding your baby, you know, the baby falls asleep right with you, baby's nice and calm, and then you go to lay the baby down. And as soon as the baby goes down, they jump and they startle. You know what I'm talking about? That startle Moro reflex, okay? That reflex is something that takes time for them to grow out of. And while they have that Moro startle reflex, the swaddling is really, really helpful. It will also help them to suppress that reflex while they're sleeping so they don't keep waking themselves up, okay? So that's a really important point for you guys to know. And it's so interesting. If you want to hear a little bit more about this Moro reflex, like why is it even there? Like what causes it and what triggers your baby? And you'll see that it's their head actually going back and the baby laying back. So putting them down actually triggers that reflex in many ways. They think that it comes from babies being held. So, you know, we are a carrying species, okay? And this is what we're meant to do. We are meant to hold our babies. That's how we care for our young. I mean, there are all different kinds of animals on Earth. Some animals are born and they follow, right? Some animals are born and they sit in nests. But human babies are meant to be carried. And what happens is they think that over our evolution, as babies were held, if they started to fall out of the mother's arms, what would happen is it's a reflex to grasp and startle, okay, and grab onto the mother's hair. So it's sort of like a reflex to hold on, and that's what your baby is exhibiting, although not that necessary, and is keeping them awake, okay? So it's part of that whole Moro reflex. Very interesting, right? Very interesting. I find that to be very interesting. So that's one of the things that we can accomplish with swaddling, all right? It's also one of the things that we can accomplish with baby wearing. It's also something that we can accomplish just by holding and nursing our babies and doing skin to skin. All those things are going to help the baby to feel confined, to feel more tight, okay? I don't know how else to say it other than tight, because that's what they're used to. And when we talk about the whole concept of predict, why do all babies like this? You know, all babies like this because they all came from the same place. And all the time, I talk to parents and they'll say, and I'm sure a lot of you are going to say this, or you've heard people say this, my baby hated being swaddled, all right? How many of you guys have either heard that or you feel that way about your own child, okay? My baby hated being swaddled. Why? Because they busted out. As soon as I put them in it, they would bust out of it, so they must have hated it. How many of you guys have had that happen? Because I know I've talked to so many people who say that. Now, the point is that it's not really the case that they all hate being swaddled. It's the fact that if you swaddle them and they can get out, they're not going to like it. Okay, so that feeling of they're naturally going to want to get their arms up. They're naturally going to want to, fight against it. But they do like the feeling if they do have something to press against. Okay, and that's what I love so much about the Love to Dream Swaddle Up swaddling blankets. And I'm showing you that here. I got some babies behind me, and the differences in this swaddle blanket is very obvious than what you've seen and what you see out there, okay? And this just was so amazing. When I first saw this, I thought, this is just one of those genius things, and why didn't I ever see this before? It makes so much sense. How do we like to sleep? We like to sleep with our arms up like this, okay? And that's what this swaddling blanket does. It keeps the arms up, so it's this very comfortable fabric, but it gives them that confinement of the arms, while at the same time allowing them to bring their hands to mouth, to self-soothe, to suck on their hands, to rub their cheeks. Those are all the ways that your baby can start to soothe or attempt to soothe. And honestly, when they're in the womb, their hands are up like this. That's the point. And they're able to do all that. It's when they're out and they're loose that it frustrates them. They try to suck and they pull their hand away. They have no control. That's for about the first 3 months, okay? So that's about as long as you're probably gonna keep their arms in here, because it's as long as it takes for the Moro reflex to disappear. It's as long as it takes for them to start rolling over, which is when you would start to transition. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like when you transition out of these, because they've thought of everything, and I'm gonna show you in a little while. But that's basic when it comes to soothing for your baby, okay? It is a complete myth that if you keep your baby awake during the day, that they'll sleep better at night. That is not how it works. And your baby not only needs to sleep well during the day, but your baby also needs to sleep in a quiet space. Okay, now I know this is different than what you'll hear, because you'll have moms and grandmothers and people telling you, let the baby get used to the noise, let the baby sleep, run the vacuum cleaner and let the baby be around all the noise. But honestly, that is not the best thing for your baby. Your baby may look like they're sleeping, okay, because they kind of check out. When they're overwhelmed with all the noise during the day, they go to sleep, but their brains are still taking in all that noise around them. And what happens is that stimulation to their brains makes them overtired. And by the time the evening comes, and you all know what I'm talking about, that witching hour later on in the evening where the baby starts to just get fussy. My kids would get crazy, like around 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock at night. That time of night is when it just catches up with them. And babies that don't sleep well during the day wind up not sleeping as well during the night. So if you've got a baby that's not sleeping good at night, I always ask, what kind of naps is that baby getting? And if the baby's getting naps, but then where is the baby sleeping? And are you on the go with your other ones? Are there other children? Is the baby going into a nice dark room, white noise, womb simulation, where the baby actually gets to sleep? Okay, because if not, and the baby's fussy at night, it's one of the places to look. It's one of the places to look, okay? And so I really encourage you to get some good naps for your baby, even if you have to go lay down and sleep too, okay? But do something so that the baby will actually sleep well during the day, okay? Do not keep your baby awake during the day to get better sleep at night. Yes, okay. I can't help but read the comments. Okay, I'm reading comments here. All right, so let's get hearts. Let's get hearts. Overtired babies. How about overtired mommies? How about overtired lactation consultants? Hearts for all of us. Hearts for all of us tired moms. I've got teenagers now, almost 2 teenagers, okay? My oldest just turned 15. I can't even believe that, okay? Because I'm sitting here thinking, as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking about her as a baby, my first. And Joe was working like an hour away at that time for a company, and I was home with the baby, and I remember at 7 o'clock, remember Joe? Every night it would be on his drive home, she would start to cry, and it would go on the entire time that he was driving, and I would call him on the phone, and I would just be crying because it was just I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. But she was good. That was like the only time, you know, she was just really fussy at that time of the night. Then I had Talia. She's my second. A lot of you guys met Talia because she'll come on with me. Talia's going to be 13 in May. Sweet sugar now. Yeah, 13 in May. I'll have 2 teenagers this spring. Now they'll both be teenagers. And she was a great nurser. She was a miserable baby. I mean, she just cried all the time. And I just didn't have the tools and the knowledge that I'm teaching you right now. You know, this is one of the reasons why I told you about breastfeeding, about everything I do, is like so much of it is things I didn't know. And I was delivering babies. I was a midwife. I had been practicing for, you know, over 10 years at that point, and I still didn't know a lot of this information when it came to breastfeeding. And I definitely didn't know this information when it came to soothing my baby or understanding their needs or womb simulation or swaddling. We didn't have any of this. So we just we would just cry and breastfeed all the time. And eventually after like a year, no, it took longer than a year, she cried for a long time. She's really sweet now. So if that's any consolation, it's usually the ones that cry a lot that are pretty easy later. That's what I found. He's saying she cried because we didn't know what we were doing. She had 2 very stupid parents at the time. Anyway, so that was one. So okay, getting good sleep and not letting your baby get overtired. Third thing on the list. Okay, if you're breastfeeding, or even if you're formula feeding, but I was directing this towards breastfeeding. One of the things to look at that could be a reason that your baby is very fussy and crying could be intolerances, food intolerances. And what that means is if you're breastfeeding, it could be something that you are eating that's causing your baby to be fussy. I'll hear people saying they've cut everything out of their diet. They're not eating any vegetables. They're not eating anything. They're eating like plain chicken and rice and just not getting any nutrition at all, and that's completely unnecessary. One of the most common reasons or common foods, the most common thing, and the first thing to look at if you think that the baby's reacting to something in your diet would be what? Dairy, okay? So cow's milk. Cow's milk is the one thing that many human babies cannot tolerate. It's a different type of protein that is more dominant in cow's milk than in breast milk and human milk. And babies just were not born, or human babies were not meant to be drinking cow's milk. They're meant to be drinking human milk. And so even though some can tolerate it, many cannot. And many adults cannot either, but for different reasons. When I say that they have an intolerance, what that can show up as is, you know, extreme fussiness, gassiness, discomfort. It can look like green poop, okay? The poop can be really green from an irritation of their bowel over time from the dairy. So it's the first thing to think about and try to cut out of your diet if you think it's something in your diet that you're eating. Also, remember, it could take several weeks to completely come out of your milk. So it could take, up to 2-3 weeks for it to fully come out. And dairy is in so many products, and it can be hidden in products, not just drinking milk. So you got to be very aware of what you're looking at when it comes to cutting it out of your diet, then giving it some time and seeing if the baby does better. Both of my children had this intolerance, and it was not unusual. Half the people that I talked to have this, okay? Their children have this. That does not mean that their children are allergic to milk or allergic to dairy. They grow out of it. Both my kids were done with it by the time they were a year old. It was fine. And we still don't eat a lot of dairy for other reasons. And I have some other episodes that we can show you about dairy. But as far as newborns or babies, many of them cannot handle cow's milk. So that would be the first thing to cut out. If it's not the dairy and it's something else that's causing your baby's fussiness, what you can do is start eliminating one food at a time to figure out what it is. But I really don't even want to go over all those things because dairy is the most common one, and it's not even that good for you anyway. So I would say you don't need it. Now, remember, it's not a lactose intolerance, okay? And this is where people get confused about the baby's milk protein intolerance versus lactose intolerance. Lactose is the sugar that's in milk, not just cow's milk, but in breast milk as well. There is the protein. The protein is what they're intolerant of. Lactose, babies are not lactose intolerant. In fact, it's very, very, very rare to have a lactose intolerant baby because breast milk has 10 times the amount of lactose in it as cow's milk, okay? That's why it's so sweet. So it's not the lactose. So if you think you're gonna go drink like lactose-free milk and that's gonna be okay, it's not. You just have to avoid it. Both, like I said, both my kids had this. It took me a while to admit it to myself because I had to cut out everything. I mean, the littlest bit of cheese sprinkled on my pasta, they would be up all night, okay? And so if you want to pay attention, when is your baby most fussy? What did I eat? Can you trace it back? It could be. Now, like I said, it could take a while to come out of your milk, so kind of have to play with that one. The other thing too, if your baby's not sleeping well, caffeine, okay? Now, caffeine is fine when you're breastfeeding. You can have some caffeine. It's not all babies will react, and if you can drink caffeine and your baby's sleeping and you're doing okay, go ahead, have the caffeine in moderation, of course. But if you're having issues, the baby's super fussy, the baby's not sleeping, it could be affecting the baby, and in those cases, I would start cutting it out, okay? So that has to do with ingredients in your food. Okay, what is it that you're eating? Now, if you're formula feeding, keep this in mind too, because most of the normal formulas are made with dairy, okay? That's the component. It's cow's milk. That's what they're based with. And you really don't want to do the soy, okay? So I would avoid the soy, but that dairy in the formula is what they could be reacting to, all right? Next, let's talk a little bit about reflux, okay? Because this is a topic that you hear so much of, and I see clients all the time that are talking about the fact that their baby has reflux, that their baby's on medication, that even the medication's not working. What is this all about? Now, some babies can have a more severe reflux reaction, and yes, it can be the case. But for the majority of people that I see, reflux tends to be very overdiagnosed. And why I say that is because all babies, to some point, have some reflux. Babies are born with an immature digestive system, with a sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach that is weak. Okay, it's naturally weak. That's the way they are for the first year. And what happens is the baby, when the baby has that weak sphincter, once the milk goes in, if the baby lays down afterwards, if the baby's overfed, which we're going to talk about, that milk can come back up. And so all babies have a little bit of reflux to some degree. Now, if the baby is projectile vomiting, if the baby is spitting up constantly to the point where the baby's actually losing weight or having no weight gain, or those kind of issues, then yes, we're talking about a more severe case of reflux. but just some spitting up. We call them happy spitters, babies that just puke and then they smile at you and they're fine, they're not in pain, and they're gaining weight, no problem. Some babies just throw up a lot after their feedings, and this can go on a lot for the first year. I think around 4 months is when it actually peaks, that they're can be spitting up the most. Kind of makes sense because I think their intake is just gradually increasing until that point. But the point is that a lot of babies will have some form of reflux. If your baby does have a lot, if baby tends to spit up a lot, you may want to not lay them down after the feeding. You may want to do more sitting up type of feedings when you're breastfeeding, or if you're bottle feeding, sitting them up more for the feeding, doing some more laid back feeding where the baby's laying on top of you so that they have a little more control over it. And not laying them completely flat afterwards, so that you prevent that milk from backing up and backflowing into them. But that's, you know, when we talk about this reflux, so much of the time it has to do with the next topic that I'm about to bring up, and it's such a simple topic, yet it is so overlooked, and it is one of the most common mistakes that new parents make when it comes to feeding, whether it's bottle feeding or breastfeeding, and it causes so much of this fussiness and crying that can be avoided, okay? So if your baby is not being burped properly, you're gonna struggle with all this fussiness. Why? Because it is a myth that breastfed babies don't need to burp. They do need to burp, okay? They do need to burp. Anyone who swallows air. That means if they're at the breast or the bottle, they're going to need to burp, and some babies may need to do it more frequently than others. That has to do with lots of different things. It's how are they sucking? How are they latched? How fast is your milk flowing? All these things can cause the baby to swallow more air during a feeding, sometimes more than others. So I can't tell you exactly when to burp the baby or how often to do it, but I could tell you what kind of signs to look for, because your baby's actually giving you very subtle and sometimes not so subtle signs that they need to burp, and you're just not realizing what it is. And then what happens is you don't actually take them off and burp them. They keep on eating, all right? They're feeling that bubble, they keep on eating, and now that little tiny air bubble that would have been so easy to get out, to take out and burp out of them, now has to travel all through their intestines for hours, okay? And that's gonna hurt. It hurts. So they feel that gas, and that gassiness is what causes the crying, causes the fussiness, and causes so many problems that can be avoided, all right? So here's what you wanna look for. It's not a timing thing, okay? And it's not like the feeding's over, so it's time to burp the baby, which you're gonna burp after the feeding as well. I'm gonna turn down the camera a little bit, okay? The baby, okay? My baby's sleeping here. I'm actually gonna use an awake baby because that's part of it, okay? So this one is awake. The hair is a little crazy, okay? We got some crazy hair going on here. Some static, okay, but we got an awake baby and a nice wide open mouth. How nice is that? Okay, so you're nursing the baby, and now what happens is the baby is latched and the baby is nice and calm, and then baby is sucking and eating, okay? The whole body should be nice and relaxed at that point. When you've got a good latch, the baby shouldn't be struggling, the baby should be nice and relaxed. At some point, the baby will start to arch, okay, or pulling off, okay? If they start to pull off, very often what that means is the baby just swallowed an air bubble. They start to arch their back or pull off, or they straighten their legs or their arms, or they just do a little bit of a wiggle, okay, out of nowhere. What happens with that is the baby's telling you, I just swallowed air. I need to get this up. I need to be burped right now. Think about when you're drinking something, okay? You're drinking a soda, or you're drinking a beer, okay? And you drink it and that air bubble goes down. That hurts, okay? You know that feeling that you get, and it makes you kind of, you know, clench. That's what the baby's doing. And at that point, what you need to do is take the baby off the breast or take the bottle out of the baby's mouth and get a burp out. Now, sometimes easier said than done. And so I want to show you my technique for burping a baby, because I do this different than what you might be seeing. So typically you take the baby off, and this could be like literally a few minutes into the feeding. If you have a very heavy letdown, it could be a minute into the feeding. That first minute, you get that heavy letdown of milk and the baby gulps really hard and needs to burp, okay? And if the baby's been crying at all before the feeding, the baby may need to burp before you even latch the baby on, okay? Because lots of crying could have them swallowing air, and they're gonna feel full, and they're going to actually be in pain before you even get started, all right? So crying is one of the reasons to burp as well. But you got the baby latched on, the baby starts to pull, you say, ooh, time to burp. Now, you take the baby off. The baby is going to be pretty angry that they're being removed off the breast. And two of the things that you need, in order to get the air out of the baby, two things need to happen. One, the baby needs to be awake, so you don't want to wait till the very end, okay? And the second thing is they need to not be crying, because if they're crying or sleeping, they're unable to be relaxed enough and awake enough to get that air out. If they're crying, they're too tense, okay? So you need to get them to stop crying. And if they're out asleep, they're too relaxed, the air is not going to come out either, all right? So you take them off. Now, how many of you do this? Okay, because that's the typical way that people burp babies. When you take your baby off and you start to pat them, what will happen is the patting motion, if you're doing it, if you're patting them, can actually make them tense. It's not really what they need. And if you think about it logically, do you really need someone to pat you on the back when you need to burp? No. What you need to do is you need to relax, you need to straighten yourself up and let the air out. So when you relax, the burp comes out. You're not like, Joe, can you pat me? No, we don't need that, okay? The baby doesn't need that either. So you take the baby and you're gonna hold the baby under the baby's jaw like this, not around the neck, but under the jaw. Pinky under the arm, which will stabilize their head and their neck together. And then you're gonna grab their butt, okay? And just like this, you hold them in this position with holding their butt, and you're gonna move them up and down. Now, make sure that you lean the baby forward so that there's pressure on the baby's diaphragm. Your hand is sort of resting on their diaphragm. The weight of their body is putting a little bit of pressure, okay, on their diaphragm. And the baby also can't jerk themselves backwards. It's very important to lean them this way. You'll have better control over the baby by leaning them forward a little bit, okay? Hold the baby's bottom and move them up and down, sort of like I'm doing right now. It's messing with the what do you call it? The focus on my camera. Okay, so move them up and down, move them up and down, move them up and down until you get a burp. Now, one of the things that what you're doing is you're not trying to shake the air out of the baby, okay? What you're doing is this motion, okay? This motion stimulates the calming reflex in your baby that we talked about earlier, which is womb stimulation. Movement creates a reflex in the baby where they can't help but get calm. Think about your baby in the uterus, okay? What would happen if your baby got fussy inside? One of those instincts is all that womb stimulation. When you put that all together, it's going to cause the baby to get calm. They actually cannot help it, okay? So movement like this is one of those things. If this isn't doing it, you can shh in the baby's ear, okay? So it's saying it's frozen. Can you guys see me? It's showing, it looks frozen on my screen here. What?
I just shut down, so.
Oh. Okay. Oh, I'm back. Okay, good. All right. I can see you in the reflection.
Still?
Yeah, you can say hi. Want to say hi? Say hi, Joe. Where's Joe? I don't know what's happening with the computer tonight, but.
Well, if it was me, it won't be because I'm off.
All right, thanks, Joe. All right, awesome. So let's get back to this. So womb stimulation, I was on a roll. I don't know what happened just now. Okay, so the womb stimulation is a reflex to the baby to calm down, okay? And they relax when you start putting all those things together. Everybody's saying hi to you now. Okay, so then when you start to move the baby and shush the baby should calm down, at least for the moment, okay, at least for a few moments to get that burp out. As soon as you get that burp, you can put the baby right back to your breast again. Now, the burping, it may be frequent throughout the feeding, okay? It depends on the feeding. First thing in the morning when you have a lot more milk, it may be more often. Later on in the evening, when you have less milk, it may be less often. Again, you have to watch for the signs from your baby. And if you have a baby that's really fussy, or you know there's a lot of air going in, or you're having problems with a lot of spit up, one of the things I would do is burp the baby more frequently, okay? Now, as you can see, this could get really heavy. As the baby gets bigger, this may get harder and harder to do. Another way that you can do this is to put the baby over your shoulder, but you need to kind of exaggerate that motion so that your shoulder is now acting as that pressure on the baby's diaphragm. So the baby's up over your shoulder, and here you can just move the baby up and down the same way as I'm doing right now, and you can still do the shh. Okay, again, all we want is a few moments to get that burp and then back to the breast. Sometimes the burp is, and don't expect this really loud burp. Sometimes when the babies are bottle fed, you'll hear a really loud burp, okay, because they're swallowing a lot of air. When they're breastfed, it could be just a little tiny, you might not even hear it. You might just feel the vibration on your hand, okay? You might just say, oh, I felt that. Okay, it came up. And that, what you couldn't even hear, that little air bubble that you couldn't hear but you could feel, was enough to keep the baby fussy for 3 hours afterwards. So I cannot stress this more. I just cannot stress this more, because I can't tell you how many babies are on medication unnecessarily, and it really comes down to burping. It's part of the thing, it's one of the things that is not taught often enough. There's lots of books out there that talk about womb simulation and all these different things, and nobody, or they talk about breastfeeding, a lot about breastfeeding, but nobody talks about the importance of what are you doing to keep the baby well through the feeding so that there's not a lot of air going into the baby's belly. You're going to be surprised how fast it works. So much faster than the padding. And with the padding, you kind of get frustrated. Now you're really padding, and the baby's just getting tenser and tenser and tenser. It is one of the best things that I can teach you. I know it's one of the simplest, most basic things, and so you go, is it really important? It's super important, and it's something that they need to do all the time, okay? All the time. Like I said, if they're crying a lot, you want to try burping as well, because they do swallow a lot of air when they cry. Next, okay? Feeding issues, overfeeding issues, okay? This is a big problem, overfeeding babies. And I usually show you the bottles of the sizes of their feedings, especially if they're breastfed, how big their bellies are, how much they should be eating at a feeding, how little they should be actually eating at a feeding, and how frequently people are just overfeeding and overfeeding their babies. And that overfeeding is going to cause them to feel full, gassy, stuffed. They're going to throw up more, okay? So overfeeding. Now this can happen from oversupply, which many of you guys may have, okay? Oversupply means that you're making more milk than your baby's actually eating. This will be an issue for multiple reasons. One, it will cause a much heavier initial letdown of the milk, or throughout the entire feeding where the baby is just drowning in milk, okay? And they can't help but just gulp it really hard. They may not be burping enough, like we just talked about, when the milk is flowing that fast. The other thing, if you're oversupplied and you're making more milk than your baby needs, then what's happening is there's more watery, high lactose, low-fat milk in the beginning, that fore milk, that is really only something to think about when you really got an oversupply of milk. And that high levels of lactose without the fat can cause the baby to have like an intolerant, not intolerance, but an irritation, okay? It can really irritate the baby, cause them to be more fussy, more gassy, more pain, okay? So if you feel like you have an oversupply, one of the things that you can try doing is not switching sides too soon, okay? Stick to one side during the feeding. alternate breasts until your milk supply goes down a little bit, all right? And that should help with getting the baby more of the hind milk, less of the fore milk where you're switching sides too quickly, and it will also help your supply to come down. We talk about this all the time. One of the biggest concerns is not making enough, but by being overly concerned with that, some people will pump and do things that will create oversupply issues. Having more than you need is not necessarily a good thing either. So, and it can cause more issues even than a little bit of a lower milk supply. So you don't want to create it. For some people, it's just naturally, it happens to them. I had two moms that are very close to me, cousins on both sides of our family. They might actually even be here tonight. I'm looking in the chat room. Both have new babies. Both make tremendous amounts of milk, and both called me the same night with the same thing. So I was laughing and I thought, how perfect. They should be watching this with us tonight. But it was about, you know, overfeeding and very, very heavy letdown. Okay. If you're bottle feeding, whether that's formula or, but I'm going to be talking right now about pumped milk in a bottle. Okay. You want to make sure that you're not overfeeding with the bottle either. Babies do not continue to increase the amounts of milk as they get older and older. Breastfed babies, you know, they don't eat more than 4 ounces at a time. If they are, or they're being fed more than that 5, 6, 7 ounces in a bottle, that could be causing their stomach upset. That's just not what they would take at the breast if they were going to eat directly from the breast. So you want to make sure that you're pacing those feedings, that you're going slowly, that you're stopping the baby to burp them frequently, and you're watching for signs that they're full, okay, that they're falling asleep, that they're not eating, they don't want to eat more. You can very easily overfeed a baby with a bottle. And so you have to be very careful, and you need to teach the caregivers, whoever's watching your baby, to make sure that they're not overfeeding. It is important to teach them not to overfeed. And yes, they do not continue to eat more and more and more. All right. The baby may want to keep eating because it's a way that they'll feel to soothe themselves. That means that even at the breast, okay, baby's eating at the breast, baby starts to pull, remember, they arch, they swallowed some air, and then you say to them, you know, kind of like, well, you just latched on, get back on, and the baby will go back to it. The baby will start to suck again. They're trying to soothe themselves, and the way that they know to soothe is to suck. So they'll continue to suck, which means they're continuing to eat. And then all that milk's going on top of that little air bubble, and it's never going to come out, okay? If you're feeding with the bottle, yes, they'll keep sucking, even though they're full, because they want to keep sucking, okay? Now, I see Caitlin just said, what about, so don't comfort nurse? Absolutely comfort nurse. Here's the difference. Don't comfort bottle. All right, you can comfort nurse, but don't comfort bottle. I'm talking about when the baby's at the breast and they're pulling because they need to burp, take them off to burp and put them back to the breast. You really can't overfeed the baby at the breast because they can suck and stop the flow, or, you know, with normal circumstances, if you're not completely over full, they can control the flow at the breast. So it's okay for the baby to breastfeed for as much as they want. Much of that time, they're not actually taking milk in. Most of the feeding's over in the first few minutes, and then they're just sucking because they like to suck, which is totally great, okay? But most of that milk is coming out in the first few minutes. But with the bottle, quite different. And that's what happens is that they're trying to suck on the bottle the way they do with the breast, and they're just going to keep on eating, all right? So with the bottle, what I would do is have them take the bottle out, use a pacifier for sucking in between, and see if that works, okay? Now, you might need to do the swaddle, you might need to do the white noise, you might need to do the motion and the pacifier, and then the baby relaxes and doesn't look still hungry, okay? Crying is not necessarily hunger. And every time the baby cries, if a bottle gets put in their mouth, they're going to overeat, okay? Every time the baby cries, if you put them back on the breast, that doesn't mean they're going to eat, but they could suck, and that is fine, okay? So I hope you understand the difference there. Totally different. Now, let's move on. The next thing could be, we just talked about overfeeding. What about hunger? Okay, what about hunger? Your baby's crying. Could it be hunger? I mean, yeah, it could be hunger. And so there's a couple things that I want you to keep in mind here. If your baby's crying for hunger, it could be the way you're latching. A bad latch, An improper latch, one that is making it difficult for the baby to transfer milk. Now, this is usually in the beginning, okay? Could cause the baby to cry because they're actually hungry. And so it's one of the things you have to test out. You can't just assume that it's, oh, they just want to be swaddled, or just give them a pacifier. Don't do that. You want to make sure that they're eating, okay, that they're gaining weight, that they are peeing at least 6 to 8 wet diapers a day, and that they're getting milk, okay? So if they're crying for hunger, that's the first thing to check. First thing is to make sure that they are actually eating. You're listening for audible swallows. You're checking for a good latch. You're feeling your breast before and after the feeding to make sure that it feels softer. You're watching their wet diapers. All of these things are going to tell you that the baby's getting milk. If any of those things are not happening and the baby's not gaining, okay, and I don't mean large amounts of weight, I mean slowly gaining and, not losing weight, then you want to check out and get to a lactation consultant and make sure that the baby is latched well, okay? Because an improper latch, tongue ties, lip ties, any of these things can cause the baby not to latch well to the breast, and that could be why the baby's crying. The baby could be hungry. So the last thing we want to happen is for the baby to feel hungry. Or minimizing the feedings, delaying the feedings, thinking, I got to watch the clock. The baby's crying and you're like, no, it's only been an hour and a half or an hour since the last feeding. It can't possibly be hungry again. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. And so you cannot time those feedings. You cannot look at the clock to determine, is it time to feed again? You have to listen to the baby's signs, because babies go through growth spurts. They go through natural growth spurts at around 2 to 3 weeks, 3 months, 2 to 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months, and 6 months are around the times when they have these natural growth spurts, and they can happen anytime. But the way that it shows up is that the baby is hungrier, wanting to eat every hour. You just fed the baby's still hungry, or the baby's kind of struggling and eating a little bit at a time. What's happening is the baby is helping to increase your milk supply, okay? The baby is trying to increase your milk supply because the baby is growing. So the hungry cry. Yeah, the way the baby sounds when they cry when they're hungry usually does sound different. And as you get to know your baby's cries, you will usually to be able to tell the difference when the baby's actually hungry and when the baby is crying for something else. Sometimes they're crying because they're full and you're trying to shove them back on the breast and the baby's rejecting the breast and you're like, oh, what's the matter? I'm not making enough. No, the baby just ate, had a full feeding, and it only took 5 minutes and the baby's actually done. And that's why they don't want to go back on, and continuing to shove them back on could have them cry when they don't want it. The difference between that and a hungry cry is different. And I love seeing that you're all posting here, yes, I know my baby's hungry cry. And actually, we don't even want to be waiting until we hear them with the hungry cry. We want to be feeding them before that, okay? So you want to pay attention to all your baby's cues for feeding. Make sure you're feeding very frequently. Make sure that you're always offering first. Offer, see what the baby does, and then listen and watch for signs during those feedings to burp and to know when they're finished, okay? Teething, okay? Teething could be a reason that your baby's crying. Remember, they can start to get teeth very early, and that could be one of the reasons why they are crying, okay? So teething could be causing it. Illness, okay? So if they're not feeling well. So there are many reasons why the baby could be crying. I'm not going to get into every detail of these, but these are all some of the things that can cause fussiness in the baby. The truth is that even with all those, some of the very basic techniques that we just talked about when it comes to swaddling, when it comes to baby wearing, when it comes to nursing and holding your babies, all those things can help a lot, all right? Can help a lot. And the last thing I just want to say about that is your baby knows you over anybody else, okay? And sometimes the fussiness or the crying could just be, I want my mommy, okay? I want my mommy. I don't want anybody else. And especially if you're working and you're gone all day and now you come home, that baby might be crying the whole time you're home. Why? Because they want you to hold them the whole time. They miss you and they want you to hold them, and they know that they're not with you and they want to be. And so they're enjoying every moment of it, even if it doesn't seem like it, because they're fussy and whatever it is, they want you. So that skin to skin with the baby is super important. doing skin to skin as much as possible when you are home with the baby, baby wearing as much as possible when you are with the baby. All those things are going to make a huge, huge difference, and keep on burping and swaddling. Okay, so those are some of my most basic tips here for calming your fussy baby. And I really feel for all of you guys. I know the feeling of what it's like to live with a baby that likes to cry a lot, how difficult that can be when you don't know what's actually happening. I hope that you can go through some of these tips that I went through tonight and at least eliminate some of it. You know, being able to burp the baby effectively, knowing how much a baby's supposed to eat and not overfeeding them, knowing how to eliminate some of the most basic things in your diet that could be affecting the baby. You know, understanding about proper latch or oversupply issues, or the most basic of all, understanding that your baby wants to jump back inside, okay? And so that feeling of being inside of you is something that they don't lose for several months afterwards, and creating and recreating that environment of the womb is going to be one of the best tricks, okay, that you can do to keep your baby calm as much as possible.